The BBC will review its editorial practices in light of Martin Bashir's 1995 interview with Princess Diana. A recent inquiry found that Bashir acted in a deceitful way to secure the interview. The BBC has apologized for falling short of high standards of integrity and transparency over the matter, with its own internal probe in 1996 proving woefully ineffective. Bashir apologized for mocking up documents but said he remained immensely proud of the interview. Some have condemned the BBC, while others argue that such backlash is hypocritical. What can the media industry learn from this incident? I'm pleased to be joined via Zoom by Barrie VVeiss in Ghislaine in southwestern China. He's the founder of Best China Info, a website trying to capture snapshots of real life in China. Mr. Weiss, thank you very much for joining us. First, I'd like to say that we're not here to try to smear the BBC or to make it look even bad, even worse when things like this happen. We're here to find out exactly what happened so we in the media industry can really all learn a lesson. Nobody's perfect, and yet there is a lot to be learned. I mean, the investigation came after Earl Spencer, Diana's brother, made fresh allegations late last year that he was shown false bank statements which encouraged his sister to take part in Bashir's interview. That's 25 years after the interview was conducted.
Yes.
Why did it take so long for
time.
truth to come out? Yeah.
Because there is a fear culture in the BBC which tells people to keep quiet, and it takes so long because things get covered up. And there's this term, there's a misunderstanding about these bank statements. These bank statements were not so much to encourage Princess Diana to do the interview, excuse me, they were used in a nefarious way to actually scare Princess Diana into doing the interview. These bank statements were trying to show, they were faked, they were forged, and they were trying to show, they were giving the implication that people were spying on Diana from outside and from within her own household. So they were using fear as a weapon to convince her to do the interview.
A couple of things to unfold there. I'll get to them one after another. But first, Prince William, the Duke of Cambridge, one of Diana's sons, said that what saddens me the most is that if the BBC had properly investigated the complaints and concerns first raised in 1995, my mother would have known that she had been deceived. Why did the BBC found no problem in its initial internal investigation back in 1996?
Why? Well, that's only for the BBC to answer. My guess is that this is not the first time this has happened. This happened several times, and I can give you various instances of when this happens, when the BBC are supposed to be investigating themselves internally, and they don't, and things get covered up, things get brushed under the carpet. So it's not the first time. In 2016, there was a report done onto allegations. No, it was actual crimes. Paedophilia, sex crimes against a very well-known presenter of the BBC, Jimmy Savile. And there was an investigation some years later, and this investigation promised after this investigation that the BBC would look into things properly, would regulate itself properly. So this is back in 2016, from things that happened 20 years before. And still we have this now in 2021, where the BBC again are accused of not putting their own house in order. So it's a repeat offence.
Do we know the whole story, all the details at this moment? I mean, the BBC has just announced that they are going to investigate why Bashir was rehired in 2016 as a religion reporter. He left the BBC in 1999, 4 years after the interview with Diana, and he joined the ITV. And, you know, there is a 17 years in between. What could have happened that the BBC rehired someone who clearly had, people had clear complaints about him, although after an internal investigation there were no clear wrongdoing?
It's jobs for the boys. It's the old school type. Excuse me, if you know what I mean. I'll give you an example, and I've already mentioned this culture of fear that in the BBC, where people don't speak out. You are instructed in no uncertain terms not to speak out and not to blow whistles. The person that they hired, they paid to create these faked bank statements was already employed by the BBC, a graphic designer. Once he created these fake bank statements, his house was burgled, and the only things that were taken in this burglary were the files that he'd created to fake these documents, the computer files. And then after this graphic designer was sacked by the BBC, and he's never been re-employed, but Bashir got a job back. So you worked that one out.
But it's, you know, after the Dyson investigation, actually Lord Dyson was unable to pinpoint anyone who actively cover up. He said he was satisfied there was a cover up, but he was not able to put a finger as to who exactly among the senior management. But what you were saying was actually something much more serious. Literally, there was some kind of active, order or something being carried out to prevent the truth from getting out. For instance, if the home was burglared, was broken into, and only the concerned documents were taken out, clearly there was an order and there was an action on the part of some people to cover this up. But could you substantiate your statement, because that's quite a serious one?
It's a fairly widely read already news report. I can send you the link to that later. You can check it out yourselves. But this is in the report, that this is a fact. This guy was employed by the BBC, by Bashir and his team, and therefore we must assume his producers. It's not just Bashir here, in the same way that Kathy Long is also a producer. And it's a bunch of people. It's not just one person. And it's in the report that this guy was employed to create fake bank statements, and that his house was burgled, and that he was then sacked by the BBC. This is in the report. So this is not an allegation of any kind. This is fact.
Princess Diana's interview was aired on BBC One on November the 20th in 1995 and watched by over 20 million people and countless more over the years. Well, some comments have been this way, that she had wanted to do the interview to complain and explain about her unhappy marriage. Also, there seemed to have been a letter which was published later saying that she had no regrets about doing the interview. Do you think that people might have, exaggerated the effect of the interview on her life, on her fate later on?
Well, her own son has said this had a great effect on her mental state. Her own son has said this. Her own sons have said how much this affected her. Her publicity, her biographer was a guy named Morton, and he stated quite clearly very recently she was ready to talk. She wanted to talk. She needed to talk. There were things that she needed to get off her chest. But there's a different, and there was a queue of news agencies and high-level presenters who wanted to do this interview. But the fact is the BBC and Bashir got in there first by scaring Princess Diana and scaring her brother by saying, we have these statements, look, there are people spying on you in your own house. So she was frightened into doing this. She was ready to speak anyway, and she needed to speak.
How do you look at the other piece of evidence that was presented by Bashir and used to probably support his claim that he is, immensely proud up till today of the interview? Basically, it was supposed to be a note by Diana where she said that the reporter Bashir did not show her any document that she wasn't previously aware of or hasn't seen. So based on that fact, Bashir basically said, the interview did not have a direct link, basically, to what happened later in her life. How do you look at that? Yeah,
well, they're very fond of passing this note around and saying that it was by her hand. And all I will say on that is that a handwritten note, just as with a bank statement, can be faked. That's my opinion. I'm not saying that's what happened, but I'm saying if you can fake a bank statement, you can fake a note. And if they did one, would they do the other? Quite possibly. Quite possibly.
Princess Diana's sons blamed the BBC and the interview for eventually killing their mother. Bashir, as I said, denied that, saying he was saying that Diana was happy about the interview. Whatever happened, you know, whatever she said during the interview, does that in any way exonerate the fact that he forged the bank note in the first place to secure an interview, whatever the effect of the interview might have been?
It doesn't exonerate the BBC's actions. It doesn't exonerate the fact that they used a foul means to get this interview, to secure this interview, to literally scare Princess Diana into doing this. Nothing can be exonerated. It's like a little while ago there was a scandal in the UK about phone tapping. And so then you have this fundamental situation where it's not so much the story at the end of the day, it's how did you get this story? By what means did you obtain this story? And if you obtain this story by unfair and nefarious and foul means, then the story becomes a secondary issue. It's how did you get this? So it's like a phone tapping scandal. The phone tapping scandals that happened before across the Western media. Now you have another scandal. They fake documents in order to scare somebody into giving an interview. So the means by which they obtained this interview were completely wrong.
The BBC insists it is the most trusted media in the world. Yeah, in this case, as in the past, right? They always say they stand by their reports. This time, Lord Dyson said he was satisfied that there was a cover-up in the BBC's handling of the complaints, but he was not able to pinpoint exactly who among the senior management. Was this an isolated incident in your eyes, or part of a culture within the corporation of dishonesty? Because you talked about a culture of fear. But you know, in terms of culture of cover-up, of being dishonest, do you think there is such a culture?
Of course there is. The BBC, in the words of one of their own Director Generals, exist in the shadow of the state. Now, this is one of their own directors who said this. I think it was John Burke. The BBC exists in the shadow of the state, and they always have. So to imagine that the BBC are impartial is a fallacy. It's wrong. For example, the last general election in the UK, Jeremy Corbyn, a socialist who cared about people, was completely castigated by the BBC, and the BBC have been accused of terrible things by favoring one side over the other. They are not impartial. Their own director at the time, which is a guy named Hall, Baron Hall, who has just resigned his post at the National Gallery over this new scandal, had told the media that they should seek to ban and silence any voices on social media that spoke against the BBC. I have this as a fact. Is it a factual document? He said this. We must find these people and silence them for criticizing the BBC. Finally, now, this is the guy who's just resigned. Yeah.
Finally, the UK Culture Secretary has just said that the BBC culture must change. Mr. Dowden accused the BBC of a "we know best" attitude. He said the BBC can occasionally succumb to such attitude, but there have been other criticism of the BBC for having a superiority complex and being detached from criticism. How deep does this problem go?
Well, as I say, there have been so many scandals. There is a list as long as your arm of BBC scandals that get covered up and brushed under the carpet. And then what happens is, what happened to Bashir, somebody resigns, somebody leaves their post, and then they sneak in the back door a few years later. And it's the revolving door, you know, this is what they do. So things get forgotten. The public has a short memory, but then these people are re-employed, and the whole party goes on. I can give you many examples and many instances of cover-ups by the BBC where they have then been accused of covering up and found out to be covering up, and they have had to conduct their own investigation, and the investigation always says exactly what they're saying now, that we will clean up our act, that we will be good boys in future, good boys and girls in future, and they don't, because it happens time and time and time and time again.
Many thanks to Mr. Barrie VVeiss joining us from Ghislaine, founder of the website Best China Info. Of course, this was his personal opinion, but this opinion is shared by many people. And that's it for this edition of The Point with me, Liu Xin. As always, you can follow me on Facebook and Twitter using the handle Liu Xin in Beijing. Thanks for watching. You've got The Point.